A team of archaeologists at the University of Oregon have found one of North America's oldest human-occupied sites in southern Oregon. There are discoveries so disturbing that they never make the front page. Deep in the silent caves of Oregon's high desert, scientists uncovered something buried beneath layers of ancient dust that should not have existed. Not there. Not at that time. When archaeologists pulled the object from the ground, they assumed it was another routine artifact until the lab results came back. The date was impossible, thousands of years older than the official timeline of human history in America. They tested it again, then again. Same result every time. And suddenly, one terrifying question began echoing through the scientific community. What if everything we were taught about the first humans in America was completely wrong? Before we expose what they found hidden beneath those caves, hit like and subscribe, because some people believe discoveries like this were never meant to be seen. What happened next only made the mystery darker. More artifacts emerged from the caves. Tools, woven materials, and evidence of human activity so ancient that researchers struggled to explain it without dismantling decades of accepted history. The deeper they dug, the more the official story began to collapse. Because if humans were living in Oregon thousands of years earlier than science claimed, then entire chapters of human civilization may have been erased, ignored, or deliberately forgotten. For most of the 20th century, every school in America taught the same story about who the first Americans were. The story began with a group of people called the Clovis, named after a site in Clovis, New Mexico, where their distinctive stone tools were first discovered. These were skilled hunters. They crafted fluted spear points, blades with a groove running down the center that made them lighter, faster, and more deadly. The timeline was clean and satisfying. Around 13,000 years ago, these people walked from Siberia to Alaska across a frozen land bridge called Beringia, slipped south through an ice-free corridor between the glaciers, and spread across the continent. End of story. That version of events was printed in textbooks across the country. It was repeated in documentaries. It was defended with intensity by scientists who had built their careers on it. The Clovis first model was not just a theory, it had become an institution. And then someone went looking inside a row of dry caves in south-central Oregon known as the Paisley Caves. Researchers had known about Paisley for decades. The problem was that nobody had looked closely enough. Nobody had dug deep enough. When archaeologists finally did, the evidence they pulled from the cave floor was not a weapon, not a blade, not a carved tool. It was something nobody expected. Preserved human waste, dried and hardened over thousands of years, sitting exactly where someone had left it in the dust of the cave floor. The dry desert air of that region had done something no museum could replicate. It had preserved a fragile organic clue across an almost unimaginable stretch of time. And inside those ancient, unassuming remnants was something that stone tools could never offer. Human DNA. When scientists extracted mitochondrial DNA from the samples and sequenced it, the result was unambiguous. The genetic material matched the Native American founding haplogroups, A2 and B2, direct ancestors of modern indigenous peoples of the Americas, not a vanished population, not a failed migration, real traceable ancestors of people who live on this continent today. People with families, with names, with bloodlines stretching back through the millennia to a cave most of the world had never heard of. Then came the date. The technique used was accelerator mass spectrometry, a method that measures the age of organic material directly without relying on the surrounding soil or nearby objects. The result came back at over 14,000 years before the present, at least 1,000 years before the Clovis people were supposed to have arrived. The Clovis people were not first. They were not even close. The first crack, Meadowcroft. Here is the part that rarely gets told. Paisley Caves was not the first evidence to challenge the Clovis story. It was simply the one that finally made the challenge impossible to ignore. The first crack had appeared decades earlier on the other side of the country in a sandstone rock shelter tucked into the hills of western Pennsylvania. Meadowcroft Rock Shelter sits on the bank of AA Stream about 7 miles upstream from the Ohio River. Overhanging ledges curve out from the hillside like a natural roof. One archaeologist later described it as having all the attractions of a prehistoric campsite, the kind of sheltered, protected spot where ancient travelers would have stopped without even thinking about it. In 1955, a local historian named Albert Miller reached into a groundhog hole on the property and pulled out artifacts that had no business being there. Nobody paid much attention at the time. Then, in 1973, a scientist named Jim Adovasio began a serious excavation. working downward through the layers of the floor, carefully, systematically, dating each level as he went. The deeper he dug, the older the evidence became. When the radiocarbon results came in, they indicated human presence at Meadowcroft as early as 16,000 to 19,000 calibrated years ago. In July 1980, Adovasio published his findings in the journal American Antiquity and stated plainly that the Clovis first model was wrong. The response from the academic community was brutal. Some accused him of having contaminated samples. Others simply ignored the paper. The resistance was so consistent, so widespread, and so entrenched that researchers eventually gave it a name: Clovis primacy syndrome. The continued defense of the Clovis model was described by some in the field as, in their own words, anachronistic and futile. Yet, even in surveys conducted decades later, only 38% of working archaeologists agreed with Adovasio's dates. Another 38% said they were unsure. The remaining quarter still rejected the findings outright. So, when the Paisley Caves results landed, the scientific community was already fractured. Paisley simply made it impossible to keep looking away. Rimrock Draw and the Swiss Army Knife. About 70 miles from the Paisley Caves, outside the small town of Riley in Harney County, Oregon, sits a modest rock shelter called Rimrock Draw. University of Oregon archaeologist Dr. Patrick O'Grady began excavating there in 2011. The site was not making headlines. It was yielding a few obsidian flakes here, a ground stone tool there, nothing extraordinary, nothing that screamed ancient. Then, the layers started talking. The most important clue at Rimrock Draw was not a tool or a bone. It was a layer of white ash buried in the ground like a timestamp baked into the earth itself. Scientists identified it as ash from a specific documented eruption of Mount St. Helens dated to between 15,400 and 15,600 years ago. That ash layer became a natural clock. Anything found below it had to be older than the eruption. Anything above it was younger. Beneath that ash, the team began pulling out evidence that should not have existed. 27 small fragments of tooth enamel were sifted from the soil. One belonged to yesterday's camel, a species that roamed North America during the last ice age before going extinct thousands of years ago. Another belonged to Bison antiquus, a larger, heavier ancestor of today's American bison. Both animals extinct, buried below a 15,000-year-old ash layer. Then came the tool. In the same layer, the team recovered a stone implement made from orange chalcedony, a glassy form of agate that catches the light in a way that makes it stand out even in excavation soil. The tool had multiple working edges, a curved cutting surface, a flat scraping edge, and a saw-toothed edge worn smooth from heavy use. O'Grady later compared it to an early Swiss Army knife. The wear on its teeth was the kind that only develops over years of sustained work, not a week, not a month, a lifetime. Whoever owned this tool had carried it, used it, sharpened it, used it again, and finally set it down one last time and walked away. The position of the tool in the sediment changed everything. It sat approximately 10 centimeters below the camel tooth fragments, which meant it was older than the animal remains. And those remains, when tested, returned a date that stopped the team cold. The lab ran the test once, then ran it again. Both results converged on the same window. The camel and bison teeth dated to roughly 21,000 to 22,000 years ago. O'Grady later admitted that receiving a single date that old was, in his words, extremely scary. You do not want to announce something like that without something to back it up. But now, he had two independent tests returning the same result. The animals at Rimrock Draw had died more than 18,000 years ago. The stone tool buried beneath their teeth suggested someone had been present even earlier than that. These tools belong to a category scientists call the Western-stemmed tradition. Long blades with weak shoulders and rounded bases. They look nothing like Clovis points. They were made by different hands following entirely different techniques, possibly originating from a completely different part of the world. They predate the Clovis style by thousands of years. Whoever made them was not Clovis. They were something else entirely. Ghost tracks in the White Sands, Oregon, was only the beginning. 700 miles south of Rimrock Draw, in a gypsum desert in southern New Mexico, 61 human footprints were pressed into ancient mud, and they had been waiting there, undisturbed, for an extraordinary length of time. White Sands National Park is a vast, otherworldly field of white gypsum dunes. In 2009, researchers walking across the dried beds of ancient lake sediments began noticing impressions in the gypsum. Not one or two, but 61 fossilized tracks left by people moving along the shore of an Ice Age lake known as Lake Otero. The prints were so well preserved that individual toes were visible, as was the curve of an arch. Some were small, the footprints of children. Others were larger, suggesting adults moving quickly, almost running. These were not the traces of a single individual. They were the impressions of groups of people, families perhaps, crossing a landscape that has since turned to white dust. The first attempt to date the prints came in 2021. Scientists ran radiocarbon dating on seeds from a plant called spiral ditch grass, pulled from the same sediment layers as the footprints. Results came back between 21,000 and 23,000 years old. The pushback was immediate. Critics argued that the seeds may have absorbed carbon from ancient groundwater, a known phenomenon that can make organic material appear older than it actually is. It was a fair point. So, researchers tested again, this time using an entirely different method. They analyzed conifer pollen extracted from the same layers. Pollen, unlike seeds, is not affected by groundwater carbon contamination. It comes directly from trees that were alive at the moment the sediment was deposited. The new results matched the originals exactly between 21,000 and 23,000 years ago. In June 2025, a third independent study, published in the journal Science Advances, examined organic material from wetland mud and shallow lake sediment. 3 completely separate sources, pollen, seeds, and organic mud, were tested independently. All 3 converged on the same window in time. The height of the last ice age, when the North American continent was locked under glaciers and the southern regions were cold, dry, and brutally unforgiving. Walking alongside those human footprints were the tracks of Columbian mammoths and giant ground sloths, enormous creatures that vanished from the continent thousands of years ago. Their impressions crossed the same ancient mud, preserved side by side with the people who had apparently lived alongside them. For most archaeologists, that alone would represent the discovery of a career. But White Sands at 23,000 years old is almost modern compared to what was found by accident in Southern California. The freeway dig. A routine freeway construction crew in Southern California was cutting through soil when the equipment struck something solid. The foreman walked over. What was embedded in the earth was not a rock, not a pipe, not a root system. It was bone. Curved, dense, unmistakably biological. Work stopped immediately. Paleontologists were called in. What they eventually uncovered were the partial remains of a mastodon, the large elephant-like creature that roamed North America during the Ice Age before going extinct at the end of that period. But the bones were not simply lying there as a natural deposit. Something had been done to them, and as the excavation team carefully brushed away the surrounding sediment, a picture began to emerge. The mastodon bones showed spiral fractures, a very specific type of breakage that only occurs when bone is still fresh. Fossilized bone, ancient and mineralized, does not break this way. It shatters. Fresh bone twists. The spiral fractures on these remains indicated that someone had broken into these bones while they were still new. Almost certainly to extract the marrow, a dense, calorie-rich food source that prehistoric peoples valued highly. Scattered among the bones were 5 large cobbles, fist-sized rocks that did not occur naturally in the surrounding geology. Geologists calculated that the stones were too large and too heavy to have been deposited there by water movement. Somebody had carried them to that spot. Somebody had used them as hammerstones and anvils to break open the mastodon's bones. And then, for reasons no one will ever recover, they had simply walked away and left everything behind. The dating method applied to the bone was uranium-thorium radiometric analysis, a technique capable of reaching back hundreds of thousands of years, far beyond the range of conventional radiocarbon dating. Every test returned the same answer. The bones were approximately 130,700 years old. In 2017, the journal Nature published the study. The site is known as the Karuti Mastodon Site, named after the paleontologist who first identified the bones. The authors, Stephen Holen, Kathleen Holen, Thomas Desmarais, and Richard Fulligar, made their claim in the most carefully measured academic language they could find. But the conclusion, however carefully worded, detonated through the archaeological world. Some kind of human species was already present in North America 130,700 years ago. Not modern Homo sapiens, not Neanderthals, something else. Something that the existing models of human migration do not account for, and for which the existing frameworks do not have a clear name. The mainstream archaeological community has largely avoided engaging directly with the Karuti site. It is simply too radical, too far outside the current framework, too damaging to too many careers to openly accept. So, it remains largely a subject that gets referenced carefully, discussed quietly, and never fully confronted. Who were they? Who cracked open a mastodon's bones in California more than 130,000 years ago and left their tools in the dirt? Nobody knows. Across the ocean, a different door. For most of the 20th century, the assumption was simple. The first Americans came through one door, Siberia to Alaska. The Beringia land bridge. One route, one origin, one story. New evidence from genetics and from stone tool analysis is now pointing somewhere very different, somewhere that should have been impossible to reach. The first clue that early humans were capable of crossing open water came not from the Americas, but from the Mediterranean. The island of Crete has been an island for approximately 5 million years. It has never been connected to the mainland during any period of human existence. Anyone who set foot on Crete had to get there by crossing open water, not by accident, not by drifting on debris, but intentionally using a watercraft capable of covering at least 40 miles of open sea. A research team led by Thomas Strasser and Eleni Panagopoulou found stone tools at 2 sites on Crete. The tools were not recent. They dated to between 130,000 and 700,000 years old. Their style resembled tools made by Homo heidelbergensis and Homo erectus, early human ancestors who lived and moved across the world long before modern humans existed. If those ancient people were capable of building boats and crossing the Mediterranean Sea, then the long-held assumption that early humans could not navigate open water had to be abandoned. One member of the research team stated it plainly. If early humans could move around the Mediterranean before 130,000 years ago, they could cross other bodies of water. 2. The discovery, he said, opened the door to re-evaluating every assumption ever made about early human migration across oceans. Then came the genetics. Researchers studying a mitochondrial DNA lineage called D4H traced its geographical origin back to northern coastal China. What the data showed was not one single migration into the Americas. It showed 2 separate waves, 2 different journeys made by 2 different groups at 2 very different points in time. The first wave came approximately 26,000 years ago. These people are believed to have traveled along the coastline by boat, hugging the shore from coastal China, up through the Japanese archipelago, and across the North Pacific. They were not crossing a frozen land bridge. They were moving from one coastal camp to the next, following the food supply. Fish, shellfish, seabirds, whatever the sea offered at each stopping point. It was a slow migration, possibly spanning multiple generations, but it worked. These were the people who arrived first. The second wave came roughly 15,000 years ago. These later travelers used the land route across Beringia. They are the group most commonly associated with the Clovis-era populations that archaeologists once believed were the very first Americans. It now appears they were latecomers, following a path that others had already traced by sea thousands of years before, and the evidence left in stone confirms the connection. Similar tool-making techniques have been identified across coastal China, Japan, and sites throughout the Americas. The same methods of shaping stone, the same blade designs, the same traditions of craftsmanship, separated by an ocean but linked by practice. This is not coincidence. It is a trail, and the trail leads back to the coasts of East Asia. The history that was waiting, the neat story that generations of students were taught, the one that began with Columbus, then quietly rolled back to the Clovis people crossing a land bridge 13,000 years ago, has fallen apart. Not gradually, not politely, completely. The footprints at White Sands, 21,000 to 23,000 years old, confirmed 3 times by 3 independent methods, pressed into mud alongside mammoths and giant sloths. The stone tool and animal bones at Rimrock Draw, buried beneath volcanic ash from an eruption 15,000 years ago. The teeth dating to 21,000 years or older. The human DNA at Paisley Caves, 14,000 years old, genetically linked to direct ancestors of modern indigenous Americans. The broken mastodon bones at Teruti, 130,700 years old, surrounded by hammerstones. No water could have carried there. And underlying all of it, the growing genetic evidence that at least one wave of people crossed the Pacific Ocean by boat, following the coastline from China to the Americas long before anyone in a Siberian corridor had laced up their boots. The history of human beings on this continent is far older, far stranger, and far more complicated than any textbook has ever been willing to admit. These people were not footnotes. They were here. They hunted. They traveled. They built fires and cracked bones and pressed their bare feet into the mud beside creatures we now know only from museum displays. They were the first. And somewhere out there, in the dry soil of a site that no one has excavated yet, the next piece of their story is already waiting to be found.